delightful for them brethren to dwell together in unity. In some aspects this past week, this nation has failed in that aspect, and yet in other aspects. And then today's gospel, hear and understand is not what goes into the mouth, but what comes out of the mouth that defiles. And I thought to myself, oh Lord, why did that have to be the first line of the gospel today? I may have had the luxury of studying at Oxford for the past few weeks, and I did truly enjoy it. I left you in the most trusted hands I know, my husband's, and I don't see anybody any worse for the wear. And though I tried to make it as much as a retreat as well as theological study as possible, I could not resist the temptation when I heard murmurings of what was going on to turn on the news at 7:05 Oxford time to watch the 11 p.m. news live. So I was doing a little bit of time travel. So I was watching yesterday's news in the morning, but it was live at the same time. If that doesn't confuse you, watch some Doctor Who. That will really mess you up. Oxford time is also 5 minutes behind Greenwich Mean Time. So when Greenwich Mean Time was established, Oxford decided we're not going to do that. We're going to keep our town's time, because at that time, every town had their own time. And so Oxford, and especially at Christ Church, everything starts at 5 minutes after the hour, which, quite frankly, I'm kind of used to, because service here is at 9:30, and we usually start at 9:35. So every evening, the Great Tom Tower at Christ Church famous bell rings out 101 times at 9:05. This dates from the foundation of the college, when the bell rang once for each of the original college's 100 students. Later, they added the one for everybody else. And it was just a time to let them know it's time to return, because they would lock the gates at night, and all the colleges would. So the whole town, which is a bunch of different colleges, the streets would be dead and everybody locked inside for their evening prayer and their late night studies. And then the bell remains silent until 8 a.m., when it returns to striking actually on the hour. Anyway, I did not have the luxury of being secluded from the world, nor the mad events that happened over the last weekend. And they continued to be played out in the media throughout the week. And I keep hearing that, hear and understand is not what goes into the mouth, but what comes out of the mouth that defiles. What comes out of the mouth comes from the heart, and those are the things that defile a person. So the other side of that coin is what comes out of the mouth can be a blessing, and what lifts that person up. It's a choice on how we choose to speak. There has been hate speech. People were attacked. Clergy were attacked. Our leadership in the secular world failed us big time. What comes out of the mouth comes from the heart, and my heart was breaking and being so far away I could not do anything anywhere about it. But our leadership at the United Church of Christ, specifically Reverend Tracy Blackman, who I've had the honor of having dinner with and talking with a few times, our Executive Minister of Justice and Witness Ministries, she was there in Charlotte. She was there on Friday night for a prayer meeting on the campus, or near the campus of Virginia State. Allow me to read this and read to you what she said, because she was interviewed. They tried to interview her during the protests that Saturday morning, and they had to move her away from the TV cameras because the crowd was coming after her. The crowd was coming to attack an African-American minister while she was speaking on national television. She later phoned in and spoke for a little bit, but on Tuesday, she had an interview. Now, first, let me tell you a little bit, if you don't know who she is. The Reverend Tracy Blackman is the Executive Minister of Justice and Witness Ministries in the United Church of Christ. She was also Senior Pastor of Christ the King United Church of Christ in Florissant, Missouri. Initially ordained in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. She served in various ministries and different capacities for 9 years prior to become ordained in the United Church of Christ. And she was installed as the first woman and 18th pastor in the 159-year history of Christ the King Church. She was a registered nurse, And she practiced that for more 25 years in healthcare. Her clinical focus was on cardiac care. In the later years, her focus shifted to mobile health care in the underserved communities, with the greatest health disparities being in her own region. She has a Bachelor of Science in Nursing from Birmingham Southern College and an MDiv from Eden. As a pastor, she led Christ the King and expanded understanding of church as sacred launching pad of community engagement and change. This ethos has led to a tripling of both the membership and worship attendance over the last 7 years, expanding membership engagement opportunities, and the establishment of community outreach programs, community programming, including things like a computer lab tutoring, continuing education classes, summer programming, a robotics team, that's creative, children's library, girls mentoring programs, all housed in the church. Regionally, she has worked on signature initiatives including Healthy Mind, Body, and Spirit, a mobile faith-based outreach program she designed to impact health outcomes in the impoverished areas of her congregation. Sacred Conversations on Solomon's Porch, quarterly clergy in-services designed to equip local clergy to assess physical, emotional, and mental and spiritual needs. She had a Sister SOS Summit, an intergenerational health symposium for women and girls. She worked on ecumenical, multiple faith collaborations, and was successful in providing over 2,800 additional rides to the polls during the election. She has been working nationally, internationally. Her list goes on and on. She's one of the people who helped write white privilege curriculum of the United Church of Christ. She has been recognized by President's Advisory Council on Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnerships. Her list goes on and on. I'm not going to read it all. If you want to read more about it, look her up on our webpage. The important thing is she was interviewed by Joy Reid, and she was after being in Charlottesville over the weekend. She was there for an interfaith prayer vigil. She was being interviewed on MSNBC's AM Joy with Joy Reid when they had to rush her off because the protesters saw her and started to target her. She later finished that interview by phone. And then this week, Joy had the opportunity to sit down with her again on an interview in the evening on MSNBC. Now, I had to transcribe the interview for you because, well, we can't broadcast it and the transcripts don't come out till next week. But these are direct quotes from All In with Chris Hayes on 8/14, and Joy Reid was filling in. Joy asked Tracy about what she felt about the president's comments, and she said this, and this is a quote, "I say these words with the utmost seriousness. I rarely use these words, but they apply here. Donald Trump is lying. And here's the deal. He spends more time on Twitter than he spends anywhere else. And what was happening Friday night was being live streamed. And I am telling you that we were in a church having worship service, and at no point in that service was there even a protest. It was a multi-faith worship service in a standing room only capacity-filled church with children, with mothers, with elderly, with people my age and the middle and young people. We were worshiping, and close to the close of our worship service, we received the message that we could not leave the church because a mob was approaching with the church with torches. They were chanting blood and soil. They were chanting, you will not replace us. They were chanting, Jews will not replace us. And they were chanting white lives matter for over 30 minutes. We could not leave that church. We were finally allowed to leave. We could not go out the front door for fear we would be assaulted. We were ushered out the side door and the back door into alleys. This is America in 2017, and I would not have believed it, Joy, as I was going to tell you before when we were trying to do the interview. I am from Birmingham, Alabama, she says. This is not the first time I've seen Klan rallies. It is not the first time I've seen Klan parades. But when I tell you we got in the car to leave and had to drive through this mob, which was then on the sidewalks and not in the streets, when I tell you I wept when I saw people who had exchanged sheets for polos and Oxfords. Many of them were wearing the Make America Great Again baseball caps, holding baseball bats in one arm and torches in the other. It is unconscionable that this was a deserved thing that happened this weekend. Joy proceeds to play a clip from the president's where he claimed that both groups had clubs, and Tracy responds, "Again, Donald Trump is lying. What I am telling you is that they had a permit for the park. They did not have a permit to harm people. They did not have a permit to throw full bottles of water and full cans of soda and splatter urine on people who did not agree with them, and their permit did not cover that, Joy. And I'd like to ask Mr. Trump if he has had time now to make 3 different responses to this incident, as he has even taken a moment to call the family of Heather, which he had not yet at that time, and offer condolences on the behalf of this nation. Has he taken a moment to consider the 20 people who were hurt and offered sympathy of this nation? This is not a leader. This is not a leader. And I am ashamed of what is happening in our highest office." Now, Joy proceeds to ask, who was in your group? Because the president has essentially equated that both were equal to neo-Nazis and white nationalists. And Reverend Tracy states this. She says, God bless her, "That is very interesting because this was a faith-based led group, largely clergy, all people of faith, all different faiths. There were Jews, there were Muslims, there were Christians. There were people indeed who did not profess any faith in that way, but just had the moral consciousness that said it is not okay for people to descend on a city. A city, by the way, where most of the residents are descendants of the enslaved. It is not okay for them to descend on the city and wreak terror. We knew this was going to be violent because we had the flyers. We had the promotional flyers that these groups had already sent out. There were flyers calling for race war, flyers calling to say, we are coming to take our country back. Are you kidding me? And the president wants to talk about revising history? Read some history. Black people built this country. And finally, Joy asks Reverend Tracy, in your view, were the fascist groups perpetrating the violence, or were they victims of the violence? And Tracy had simply replied, no, they were not. As a matter of fact, there were some clergy standing on the steps to the entrance to the park where they were not in the park. They were standing on the steps to the entrance to the park singing. They were singing This Little Light of Mine. When these neo-Nazi groups came, they burst through with shields and began beating and trampling on them. And the groups that Donald Trump are calling terrorists are the ones who saved their lives because the police were standing down. They saved their lives. Tracy is a gentle, loving woman, but you do not want to see her get riled up because when she preaches, she does not need a microphone. At General Conference, she got her fires going, and people asked, why is she yelling? I said, she's not yelling, she's praising. But in the midst of all this, in the midst of this pain and this anger, there was candlelight. In the midst of all this, since then, there has been peace-filled demonstrations. In the midst of all this, our clergy are stepping forward everywhere and anywhere they can to say, this is not our values. Our denomination has put out a letter in response. It says, last weekend, a group of white supremacists came to Charlottesville, Virginia, and incited violence to protest the removal of a Confederate monument. Although protest is the bedrock of our nation's democracy, coming in riot gear proves that they intended to do more than simply protest. We, the Council of Conference Ministers and Officers of the United Church of Christ, strongly condemn the acts of violent hatred expressed by these white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and Ku Klux Klan members. Their white robes and their burning crosses were replaced with polo shirts, khakis, and tiki torches, which is really ironic. While their lynching was replaced with a speeding car barreling through of peaceful protesters with the intention of harming and killing others, which it did. Their vitriolic hatred is the same. We confess that the events at Charlottesville are systemic and communal expressions of white privilege and racism that continues to pervade our nation's spiritual ethos. And if we only condemn the acts of August 12, 2017, without condemning the roots of racism, which perpetuate discrimination in our American schools, in our justice system, our businesses, healthcare systems, then we have sinned. Then we have sinned just as well. We must work toward the kingdom of heaven here on earth, now for the sake of a just world for all. And we do this by committing to follow the ways of Jesus, who stood with the oppressed. Jesus, who spoke out against the political and religious powers and courageously embodied a just world for all as he sought to create it. Today, we must follow the ways of Jesus in addressing the hatred of white supremacists and racists among us. Our local UCC churches must be true solidarity partners with those who march in the streets. Our UCC churches are encouraged to move from the sanctuary and walk alongside other clergy and community leaders who seek to resist, agitate, inform, and comfort. We must resist hatred and violence. We must also agitate ourselves and our neighbors to acknowledge any racism within or among us. We must inform ourselves and our neighbors what our sacred stories reveal to us of a just world for all. We must lament and grieve with those who are injured or murdered during violent confrontations with those who mean us harm. And we must bring comfort to those who have been discriminated against with a transformative love of God. As we go forward, let us model the legacy of activism through our sacred call given to us by our UCC ancestors. Let us be prophetic truth tellers like our congregational Christian forebearers who marched in public squares demanding equality for all. May we serve others and remain faithful witness like our evangelical and reformed forebearers who tended to the needs of the forgotten. And may we be the courageous like our non-UCC forebearers who left their spiritual home and joined the UCC in order to fully live out who God created them to be. In the days to come, the letter goes on to say, may God's truth, mission, and courage be our guide to embodying the kingdom of heaven here on earth. And again, I'd like to repeat today's psalm. Behold how good and pleasant it is when people dwell together in unity. Well, we are not. As a nation, we stand divided. We are divided by rhetoric, by education or lack thereof. We are divided by class. We are divided by race. We are divided by ethnicity, and yet most of us manage to get day by day without much a care in the world. Most of us manage to not let those things bother us because we are trying to live our lives in fully and in sacred ways. Most of us get by today without even noticing that we are not one people because we're trying to live as one people. But as we go by in our day-to-day lives, a group of people somehow got left behind. And that's what we're seeing. Somehow in the midst of fighting discrimination and winning civil rights, and some people got left behind. And my heart actually breaks for them. We cannot allow their rhetoric or radical extreme views become the norm. We must stand against that rhetoric, as the letter states. We must be prophetic. We must be prophetic truth tellers. But I will go a step further, and we must be prophetic in our prayers. We must pray for God to change hearts. We must pray for our leaders who will place themselves in harm's way so that the prophetic vision of God's love for all may be proclaimed. And we must pray for comfort. Comfort for our nation, comfort for those injured, comfort for those who are in fear, Maybe especially for those who are living in fear in their ignorance. Those are the people where we are called to. That is the hardest part of being a Christian, because that is truly loving your enemy. In the face of violence, in all honesty, every one of us, we are affected by it, whether we're sitting at home and watching it on TV, reading it in a newspaper, or if we're on the front lines. And sometimes we don't even realize how it's affecting our hearts. So again, that's when we have to turn to prayer. And maybe even this prayer was in this letter. It's a prayer of confession. And I'll share it with you. Let us pray. God of peace, give us the courage and the strength and the perseverance needed to challenge the system of racism, so that we can clear a path for your justice, peace, and equity. We believe racism is present in our society and in our church, and throughout the time has manifested itself in many forms and in varying degrees. And we know racism is alive in our language and in our structures, and through our systems, it actively works to deconstruct your glorious design, blocking the path to justice, equity, and peace that Jesus brings. Racism exists, and it challenges the gospel message that we cry. We cry abundant life for all, knowing that we are slowly being suffocated by the pervasive evil of racism. Some of us are choking. Some of us cannot breathe. Some of us are dead. We cry peace, knowing that we are instruments of God's peace and that such peace cannot exist without justice, equity, compassion, and God's grace. We cry, Emmanuel, God with us, knowing that to God every life matters. God is with all people. Even though as a community and as a society, we have stated through our actions that some lives matter more than others. We pray, compassionate one, help us to understand how racism finds life in our hearts and in our cries. In this time of tense anticipation, may we commit ourselves to be people of your way, crying and creating a path for justice, equity, and peace for all people in this wilderness of hatred and racism. Amen. That's a prayer for Black History Month by Elidia Smith. It looks easier than it is to read. So as we work to create a path for justice, equity, and peace, we know that the pathway is only lit through the love of God, and so we will join in singing the song that the clergy was singing on the steps of the park when they were attacked. We will sing This Little Light of Mine.